Okay, cool. Thank you everybody for joining. Today we have on a very exciting guest. His name is Nathan Calvin. He's the General Counsel of Encode Justice, which is a youth-led activism and public education nonprofit where they advocate for AI law. And he helped write California's Frontier AI Transparency Law called SB 53, which just went into effect earlier this year. And while the bill was negotiated, OpenAI, which is one of the world's biggest companies, pressured him quite a bit, kind of pushing back on this law. So we wanted to have him on because we typically have, technical folks from UK AI Safety Institute, Good Friar AI, but this side of AI safety, technical policy, and governance, we think is equally important part of the story. And Nathan is more than qualified as Stanford JD, former Senate Judiciary Committee, and John Hopkins Biosecurity Fellow. So I'll pass it over to him, and Nathan, the floor is yours.
Great. Let me just figure out how to share it. Okay. 1 second. Let's go into presenting mode. 1 second. Let's see. How do I just... Sorry, I don't actually do that many presentations. Okay, 1 second. How do I?
Yeah, we can see, so I think you're all good.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you all. And as Ali was saying, feel free to ask questions as I'm going. I feel like I kind of prefer the more conversational style rather than just hearing my own voice for a while. Yeah, so we're with Encode AI, actually formerly known as Encode Justice, but that's all good because we had the same name for a while. We changed names as we spun out of the organization we were previously fiscally sponsored with. But anyway, everything else is true and right. So just to talk about some of who we are as an organization and what we work on. So we're a small nonprofit advocacy organization. Based in the United States. We have some folks who are in DC and some in California. We were initially founded by Sneha Ravenor, who founded the organization actually when she was a sophomore in high school and is still our president and founder and very involved with the organization while she is a senior in college now at Stanford, which is a very unique setup. So I think initially the organization kind of had more of a particular focus of kind of a, grassroots, youth-led organization. And I think over time, we have just become more of just a kind of general AI advocacy, AI safety organization, and have just gotten into a lot of different issues that we work on. I've included in this slide just some of the examples of things that we've worked on. So, we made this resource for, in particular, kind of college students about advising them on, how to think about their career in an era of fast AI progress, and thinking about not just for people particularly interested in AI safety, but also just in general thinking about what sorts of careers are likely to be more affected by AI automation, and kind of how to go into areas where you're that are likely to be more protected against potential AI impacts. We also worked a lot on the Take It Down Act nationally, which is the first U.S. law that at the federal level that's specifically targeting non-consensual pornography and deepfakes. And so that's another example of work. But I think some of what I personally have worked the most on while at Encode is a couple of these things on the bottom here. So one is SB 53 in California, which is the United States' first frontier AI safety transparency law. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that is, as well as we were helping to lead a coalition of other civil society groups and experts on opposing and raising concerns about OpenAI's restructuring plan to from a nonprofit to a for-profit, and at least kind of making sure that as they do that, that the adherence to the nonprofit's mission of making sure that AI goes well for humanity is continued to be put over profit. So anyway, this is some assortment of the different work that we do. And yeah, just to talk a little bit about what is SB 53, and then also the RAISE Act, which is a similar bill that was passed in New York after SB 53. So there are four primary elements to what are in these laws. So one way of also just understanding it for those who might have followed was, we had Encode had previously, and actually in my previous time with the Center for AI Safety, had been working on SB 1047 in California, which was a, much more kind of ambitious AI safety law in some respects, where the way that I think about it is that SB 53 is really particularly about transparency, and 1047 was also about some of these issues around kind of required guardrails and liability. And so 53 is really particularly focused on not necessarily having like prescribed standards for like how companies should deal with these risks, or kind of what liability should be if they do cause harm, but more just making sure like make a plan, disclose the plan, and follow your plan. And if you're gonna not follow your plan, then tell us that you're changing your plan before you do that. And then also, if something really bad does go wrong, having a way to report that to the California government. Also having whistleblower protections, such that if you're someone at a company and you do see something that seems like it could have a substantial risk of a catastrophic harm, even if it's not something that's illegal, you can report that to the Attorney General in California without them being able to retaliate against you, which is also really important. And yeah, the bill is particularly focused on companies that are training models above 10 to the 26 floating point operations, including both kind of pre-training and post-training. And the incident reporting and whistleblower protections apply to all companies that are training above that threshold. But the kind of frontier AI frameworks and kind of the safety plan and system cards apply to firms that are training above that threshold, but then also have over $500 million in revenue, which with some negotiations done in California over concerns of impacts on smaller organizations or startups. To be honest, I actually think probably there may be better ways of making sure that it's at large. Yeah, it is. It's true. I mean, it is worth saying, like, there are some, it's in New York, for instance, there actually already are quite good whistleblower protections compared to California, where you already have the ability to, for instance, like report certain public safety risks, even if they don't obviously violate a specific law. In California, though, it is much more limited to, like, if you want to report something, it has to, violate the law rather than being something that is, like objectively concerning, but is not. And again, with some of these folks who are in the position of, trying to figure out whether to report something, like they really want confidence that they will definitely be protected, because, just like the threat of retaliation and losing their job and being sued. And, we've seen some of the episodes previously of, like the really broad non-disparagement agreements for the companies were requiring employees to sign, and the ways that they can, aggressively go after people. So, I think having like clarity around these protections is super important. And to be honest, also, like, I think over the course of the process with SB 53, the whistleblower protections were actually weakened a decent amount, such that I think they're not, they only apply to employees at the companies that are actually involved in evaluating the risks from models. So it doesn't apply to just like general people who are engineers at the companies, and it also doesn't apply to contractors. So for instance, if you're like a third-party evaluation thing, the whistleblower protections don't apply to you. I think both of those things are changes that I disagreed with, but I do think 53, it was, I think it's simultaneously like a very important and meaningful step, but it also, was a heavily negotiated compromise. That was something that we wanted to make sure could get through. That had to make a lot of changes through the process for the author to get that over the line. So anyway, that's just some background on kind of generally what's in the bills, and just one other thing on kind of the aimed at these are bills that are also like particularly aimed at catastrophic risks from AI models. So things like the potential for models to facilitate biological weapons attacks, or really severe cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, or the possibility of models that humans just generally lose control of and are misaligned and causing all sorts of havoc like that. And so it's there there are lots of other very important concerns around AI models, of things like algorithmic discrimination, or disinformation and political deepfakes, or all sorts of other issues that you might talk about or be worried about, or also other issues, including ones that we work on, of things like kid safety and mental health risks and things like that. And 53 is really just particularly focused on these very severe interesting. Yeah, I'm just looking at the question. So it's a little bit, it's a good question. I should look at the exact language. It's not just evals team, but there is some amount of like that you are basically an expanded definition of evals team. And so I do think there are concerns about like perverse incentives to some degree, where you could imagine like only wanting to put people in those teams who you would be would be more confident, wouldn't be raising concerns or something, and that being problematic. I will say one thing that is helpful and that actually is interesting, and I think is like sometimes misunderstood, and is a little bit of a nuance of the actual main way that SB 53 interfaces with whistleblower protections is actually not through the section about whistleblower protections. The main thing it does is that there are existing laws in California that allow you to report when someone is violating the law. And SB 53 just like creates a bunch of legal violations, like creates a bunch of legal requirements around these safety practices. And so that means that like the some of the whistleblower protections about just being able to report things that are concerning but not illegal, those would only apply to the employees involved in evaluating the models. But for some of the other requirements, where like if a company is like lying about their safety plan, or not reporting an incident that they're required to report, or things like that, then any employee at the company could raise it just under existing California whistleblower protections that apply to legal violations. So anyway, it's just an interesting nuance where one of the so one of the main ways that it really actually improves whistleblower protections is by creating more things that are illegal, rather than actually the explicit section on whistleblower protections, which is kind of complicated, but it is important. Anyway, so I mean, I think some of what's been most interesting and has kind of gotten a lot of attention, understandably, has been some of the backlash from our work on things like SB 53, and also to some degree criticizing the OpenAI's restructuring. And it's definitely not the case that that 53 is by means the only AI law that's been passed in the United States. There are lots of other other significant pieces of legislation as well on lots of different areas across states, and I think crucially also both among Democratic states as well as among Republican states. But I do think there's I think it understandably did get a lot of attention, and has been something that has been, at least in part, driving some of these at least like more broadly, just in some ways actually like the RAISE Act, which was at the end harmonized to be much closer to 53, though it had some parts that are stronger. But initially it seemed like it might pass with some even stronger provisions. And anyway, but generally, kind of our effort in particular to regulate some of these catastrophic risks from the largest companies have been one of the significant drivers of then the push from OpenAI and Andreessen Horowitz and others to get really involved with just pouring tons and tons of money into U.S. politics to try to preempt state regulations and to try to prevent there from being additional federal regulations. And just for, I know talking to some Canadians who may not be as familiar with kind of some of the details of the U.S. system here, as I'm not familiar with necessarily the details of the Canadian system, but we have these different states that are able to pass laws that apply to anyone who is doing business within that state or doing relevant activity within that state. But Congress and the federal government can preempt and block the states from doing that, but they need to actually pass legislation to do that. I have in the bottom here that Trump signed a executive order aimed at trying to stop the states. It really seems like that's not that legal and is not going to be that successful in stopping it, but at least shows some of the intention. And you can see David Sachs standing by him, who's been one of the folks within the administration who's been particularly pushing for this effort to go after state laws. Anyway, I mean, one thing to say is that, like, to some degree, these sorts of things around blowback in Congress and people pour more money into super PACs and other spending, these were sorts of things that I, given my time working in the were more expected of kind of what I thought kind of normal political back and forth was. The thing on the left here was the in some ways the more surprising part, which is that in the middle of negotiations on SB 53, a sheriff's deputy showed up at my house to give me a bunch of papers to subpoena me, asking me for all of my communications on SB 53, as well as all of my communications on the restructuring with OpenAI, nominally as part of the OpenAI's lawsuit with Elon Musk, and basically falsely accusing us of being funded and controlled by Elon. And we ended up hiring pro bono counsel and responding to them, and the subpoena didn't go anywhere, and we didn't ultimately have to turn over documents, but it was just remarkable. And again, also just like it was just a subpoena also to like our organization at our Delaware address. So just again, personally to me, there were several other organizations that were also targeted, and it really like I'm a lawyer and talk to lots of people who kind of go through these legal proceedings, and it didn't really feel like they were just trying to collect information. It really did feel like a effort to intimidate us for some of our work on things like opposing the restructuring as well as SB 53. And so anyway, happy to answer more questions about that, but that was a wild experience. Yep. And so some thoughts kind of given SB 53, as well as some of this backlash. Some of I think that there's an interesting dynamic happening where, on the one hand, again, like I think SB 53 is a really meaningful and important legislation that I'm very proud to have worked on. But again, it really is just about transparency and just companies disclosing what they are currently doing. It doesn't have any requirements around, for instance, like auditing of people, like making sure they're saying what they're doing on the things around like whistleblower protections. And it also doesn't have any requirements that like the standards they have are actually good, or that like the safety plans they have are effective at addressing these severe risks. And I think we're seeing among a lot of the conversations around benchmarks increasingly being just completely saturated, as well as just kind of the relentless pace of capabilities increases, and really strong competition between different companies that we saw both OpenAI and Anthropic put out system cards for 5.3 Codex and 4.6 Opus, and in their system cards they basically are saying things like Yeah, we think it doesn't have a high risk of long run autonomy, but like we don't really know. We don't have any way of measuring that. We don't have, we don't currently have, evaluations for figuring this out. We're relying on proxy, and then, or for Anthropic of saying like we don't think it meets this threshold, but we aren't sure. So we did a poll of 16 employees, and to Anthropic's credit, they were then saying that like they, kind of to be safe, we're still like assuming that had been met of that ASL4 threshold. But again, then kind of like what that ASL4 threshold means, is a totally separate thing. Yeah, go ahead, Alif.
Yeah, so just on this topic, as I mentioned, I was reading your thread, and it seems like SB 53 is a great step in the right direction in terms of like transparency and getting these companies to disclose exactly what the risks are. But again, with OpenAI, with the Midas project allegation, it seems like this you called it a procedural kind of error, or like something they could change. So if these companies can like change the rules whenever they want, like how do we actually have any sort of enforcement of them?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, I think this is a little bit in the weeds, but is again, I think important of like there is, as I understand it, and I don't want to accuse them confidently of having violated the law, because they have shown they are sometimes litigious. And so again, I'm going to be careful about my language, but they have been accused of potential violation. And as far as I see it and understand it, they in their framework effectively said that, if we hit cyber high risk, then we will put in these given misalignment safeguards. But then they put in a follow-up saying like, actually, that was ambiguous and we're not going to do that. That wasn't our intention. Again, I think when you read the document, it really doesn't look that ambiguous, but you could maybe make some reading of it. The point that I've made, and that some people have, like there's, some folks who have maybe pushed back on the Midas project a little bit, and maybe one thing that at least either explicitly or implicitly they're saying is that like, again, SB 53 does like allow them to change their plans. Like they could, but I think part of, if I were working with them as their lawyer, I would say like ideally you should, or not just ideally, like I think if you, it's one thing if it was ambiguous, but again, I don't think it was. But let's say that it's not ambiguous to change their plan. The right way to change their plan is not say like, oh, we never changed our plan. It's to like file a formal change plan and say you changed it, which 53 allow you to do. Again, like, and what I was actually gonna say just right before that is that, OpenAI and Anthropic, like they are having some of these issues around, saturating the evaluations and whether they're hitting these given thresholds. Like I do think there are, for instance, like XAI or Meta's plans, like they don't have any kind of these detailed things at all, and like their plans just kind of suck. And so that is also again just another aspect. And in some ways, like because they are just very boring and bad, there's less controversy and conversation about them because there's just not that much interesting stuff to talk about. And so again, like I do think that this all points at kind of a central issue that again, like this requires you to, disclose what your plan is, but if your plan is not very good, or we just like as an industry as a whole don't have good ways of measuring this, then there's not really any particular remedy for that. And so, and this is, I included this tweet also by Chris Painter, who helps run policy at Meter, which does third-party evaluations and threat evaluations with these, in part working with companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. And, I think it's worth taking very seriously when he's saying that like it feels like the current paradigm of companies trying to set these red lines around when they won't do releases and then kind of do testing to see whether those red lines are being crossed, that like that framework is just fundamentally showing signs of really tremendous strain, and that I think we do need to be thinking about different ways of what comes next and how we build on that further, kind of given that just this kind of these transparency frameworks, again, being an important step, but just really not having real limitations. And I mean, again, just one other thing as well of like, is, even if it does come about that OpenAI violated, the maximum fine under SB 53 is $1 million per violation. If an OpenAI does get fined a few $1 million, like, they're going to be $1 trillion company. Like, this is really, again, I don't think they want like headlines about how they broke laws or something. And I do think they care about it. And it also has implications for other, there are lots of reasons why it's bad to break laws separate from the fines. But it just, again, I both think, simultaneously that things like SB 53 are really important, but also that they are just pretty dramatically insufficient and narrow relative to the scope of potential risks and the some of the incentives on the other side here. So with all that said, and then I'll talk about this for a little bit, and then happy to open it up to just more general questions of I've just been thinking a lot about how is kind of the unprecedented amount of money just pouring into U.S. politics of this AI corporate money. How is that going to shape the extent to which politicians are willing to do the sorts of things like they did on SB 53 or the RAISE Act? Like, we really are. There are some precedents. So like the crypto industry spent quite a lot in the United States. There's been a lot of spending around, for instance, like pro-Israel donors. But really, apart from those two areas, as well as the parties themselves, there's really never been anything on this scale of funding that the AI companies are putting in. Like, it is just like an order of magnitude, more than what you see from like banks or pharmaceutical companies or oil companies, or just like, it is just such an incredible amount of money. And I think that there are real concerns about the ways in which this is just going to distort the political process in really problematic ways. Another thing that I'm thinking about is, there's some parts of SB 53 where, companies are submitting, incident reports, or they also have actually like risks from internal use of their and deployment of their model, which is a really significant part of the bill that I actually didn't explicitly talk about. Like, how do we make sure there are actually people within government who can interpret and understand those reports, and that like when a whistleblower reaches out or when an incident happens, how can they understand sorting out what is a real and serious risk versus what is something that they shouldn't be concerned about, and making sure that these state governments actually are able to hire talented technical and governance researchers to help them make sense of that, and that these states also are under pretty significant funding constraints, with things like the federal government taking away funding from them, and so it's very hard for them to find even a few million dollars to adequately fund these to the extent that they're needed. And so that's another thing that we're working on. Another thing that I was talking about is just that like transparency isn't enough, and I really do think we need to move to a system of having third-party auditing and verification, and that we also need to work on ways of actually having like what is a level of standard of not only just saying that you have to have a safety framework, but the safety framework has to be good. Another thing, we're also doing some of these work on risks from AI companions, particularly to kids, and I think have some ideas of policy frameworks and ideas there. I mean, I do think some of this general toolbook of things like incident reporting and transparency, and I think these are good steps that you can apply to honestly a lot of different potential harms, and that I think beyond just these risks from catastrophic risks, I think can be quite valuable. And we've seen some red states do things that are similar to SB 53, but which also include these risks and harms to children. I think separate from that, of just this, what are the right policy remedies that exist around things like AI job loss and massive amounts of, disruption and retraining, even if it is the case that lots of new jobs will be created. I think that's an area that I think is just incredibly important, and that policymakers are really desperately looking for ideas on. And it feels like the current set of ideas, I think we just need more ideas and need more seriousness to that, particularly given, I think, the scale at which some of this at least has the potential to start coming. And I think relating to that at the end of just again, it goes goes back and forth, and maybe like I think at this current moment there's like a little bit too much conversation or something about like really fast timelines or really fast acceleration of progress. But even if you setting that aside, I just do think the rate of progress just is incredibly fast overall, and just that like even just further deploying out models that are as capable as 5.3 codex and 4.6 opus to lots of sectors of the economy towards plugging them back into the process of accelerating AI research, I just think is going to have really large effects, and it is just challenging as someone who works on policy about how to figure out how to make policy and help government move at the speed of this technology that is just really moving at a just incredibly fast rate, where you like, if I'm thinking right now about like a potential state law, it's like you're going to introduce it the next fall, and then you'll work on passing it for a year, and then it'll go into effect the year after that. And it's just when we're thinking about some of these things that and that's not even then to mention if you need to kind of create new state capacity or create a new agency or hire people, that it just is very difficult to really do some of these things at the speed required. And there are ways around that, but it is just very is challenging, and something that I think a lot about. And yeah, and as Alif was saying, we are seeing just like these at least some resignations and people stepping away from AI companies while doing like we're not running stuff, so it's going really fast. And so that is definitely disconcerting. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Yeah, thanks for listening. I know that was a little bit all over the place, but hopefully was interesting, and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the kind of walkthrough of the space. I think most of us here are technical, and we have typically like guests from Anthropic or Goodfire who go into like the interpretability aspect of things, but the policy aspect, I think, is where really we start to see accountability from these companies, which is really great. I guess I'll open it up to the floor for questions, and my co-lead Abrar will probably take the reins from me at some point because I may need to drop early. But one question I want to ask before we open up is, do you think that we can draw any historical parallels from other industries? I know you mentioned this is quite different because there's so much funding and the technology is so transformative, but for example, pharma, as far as I know, fought against the FDA in the early days. And even the automobile industry, they fought against seatbelts, which in retrospect looks ridiculous. Like seatbelts are a life-saving kind of thing. So, how do you draw parallels, or is it even useful to draw parallels from those cases, or is this a completely new kind of field that we have to rethink?
No, I definitely think there are a lot of parallels. So I was actually, my wife, Amelia, is in the call, and she works on tobacco issues, and working on educating consumers about risks from tobacco, and documenting some of what the tobacco industry did to cover up harms from its products long after they internally knew, but not sharing that with the public. And I do think there are real parallels here in terms of just when companies know that there are harms, of actually forcing them to disclose that, I think is really important. And I think there are real parallels there. I think there are parts of this that are very similar, of just like, large companies and powerful interests just like don't want to be regulated, and they don't want somebody else to be able to, check their homework or tell them what to do. And again, like, I think there's some aspect where like in terms of this, like, have some sympathy for that, where like you do have really brilliant engineers and researchers and companies, and they have the idea of like, some bureaucrat in California or New York or something, like, telling them what to do, and they, find that really kind of preposterous to them. And so I do think there is, making sure that you have, talented technical people within government, or that you also have like a ecosystem of third-party auditors that can maybe be like certified by government, but they go in but have more technical expertise. And again, I will say that though, that sometimes I think the companies talk about oh wow, we're just like so smart and brilliant, and people within government can never keep up with us. Like, I talk with people like at like the California Attorney General's office. Like they have sharp people. Like they're smart. They like get this stuff like more than you might expect. And I do think I think that there's sometimes a lot of again, like there are parts of this that are really complicated, but there are parts of this that are not, that are just kind of simple. Like you said, you do a thing and you didn't do it, or you're retaliating against an employee, or you're just breaking this law, even if they might not necessarily be able to say like, oh, here's the best way you should do post training to deal with this potential risk, or this is the best, most promising research direction and mechanistic ability or whatever, like that. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like passing laws and then enforcing them. And again, I think that there's some aspect where one other thing I would say, actually, now that you're it's just occurring to me, is that I do think one sector that I think about a lot, actually, in terms of potential analogies here, is the banking and financial industry, where you similarly have it's a very complex field. Like you have particularly when you're thinking about things like lots of derivatives trading and shadow banking and all of these things, like it's extremely complex. It's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what sorts of things you want to do to mitigate risk, but it also is just extremely important. And I do think one thing that does point to that, and I think there are other people who have written about this too, is that I do think we increasingly need to be moving away from a paradigm of like focusing a bunch on just like every given like model release and like whether a company is like releasing models to the public, and much more on a holistic sense of like all of their different risks and all of their different employments, including internal deployments and deployments from existing models. And I think that there are some interesting analogies in the financial sector there. So anyway, I think there are parts of this that are new and unique, and I think you should be like wary about people who are just like, oh, this is the exact same thing as social media, or oh, this is the exact same thing as something else. But I do think there are like lots of relevant lessons to learn, and I think for policymakers and enforcers, like they are much more comfortable when you can also talk to them in the language of some of these previous case studies or previous industries that they've effectively regulated.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think analogies here like help people who are not as familiar with the area kind of understand a bit more. So that's really great. Michelle has her hand up. Feel free to take questions as needed. I'll probably have to drop now, but Abrar will be here to kind of host. But thank you so much for coming. I'll be sure to review the rest of the recording. Michelle, go ahead.
Thank you, Ali, for managing it so far. And everybody else who has questions, feel free to use the Google feature to raise your hand. That would be really helpful. I think it's Mitchell.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the conversation. I just had a question, and I don't know if I missed what you were talking about, but I still have the curiosity. When you were explaining about the main requirements of the SB 53 and RACE Act, like I will ask this question of how do you agree with the threshold of 10 over the 26 flop, for example, because if I can recall, in the case of the EU AI Act, they set a threshold of the model strain with 10 over the 25 flops, for example, they are targeted as a potential systematic risk. But I mean, like we are using this kind of different threshold, but even we know that smaller ones can be risk, for example. And I wanted to know how do you get to that agreement, and if you are also considering the future, also taking into account smaller models.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and this is one of the areas where there was negotiation and changes over the line of the process. And earlier on in SB 53, it was for companies that are of a size and where they train one model above 10 to the 26, then they have to consider risks from all of their foundation models, including foundation models that are much smaller. And again, I think there are different ways of doing it, and I agree with you that I think there absolutely are risks from models that are smaller. And the EU, they do their threshold of 10 to the 25 flop, but they might also be able to redefine that or change that. Again, I do think there's some I do think the analogy to banking here is a little bit interesting, where you think about like we do have different regulations. Like if you're a bank that has, $100 billion in assets versus a bank that has $20 billion in assets, and like can a bank that has $20 billion in assets also like pose significant risks to the financial system? Like disregarding the exact numbers, but like Silicon Valley Bank was something that was like below the threshold for some of the banking regulations, but still ended up posing some significant risks. But like these thresholds still, there's still some aspect where you just like are thinking about what are some of this is very deeply political, to be honest, as well, of like you want to make sure that you are not the more potential companies that you are trying to regulate, the more opposition you get for your bills is one thing. And also just like on a normative level, I do think we are just like genuinely more concerned about some of the compliance costs associated with applying these to smaller companies. But like all of that said, I definitely don't, in general, one message I would really hope that people take away from this is like SB 53 is not like, it is like a very important and a very good law, but it is a result of like significant compromises and negotiation and meeting in the middle on a lot of different things. And I think the scoping is one area where that's true. And I think I think that the fact that models below that, the 10 to the 26th threshold, and you can think about exactly what would replace it, are just completely absent from being covered, I think is something that all else equal, I don't agree with and would not like to see. But it's some that is, yeah. So again, I think it's much more on like kind of a, at some level you do need to outline somewhere, and you do need to have a clear thing. And there's some aspect where like, maybe instead of having it be that, 18-year-olds can vote, you decide on a case-by-case basis, and you have, some 17-year-olds who are really mature can vote, but you like kind of just need some line for clarity. And so I do think at some level you pick some rule, and it's going to be in some ways under-inclusive and over-inclusive. I think that said, I do think there are options for potentially metrics that better scope it in. But anyway, I realize that I'm sure that's not entirely satisfying, but I think you're getting at a real thing. And by no means do I think that like the definition in 53 should be like the end all be all here, and then that there are really significant risks that can be posed from models that are below that threshold.
Yeah, thank you.
Esra?
Hi, Nathan. Thank you so much for the talk. I was thinking, since like the Cohere Labs community is like actually like very active, and like a lot of us are like very self-driven as well in terms of like the things that we pursue. So I was thinking like how do you see ways in which sort of engaged citizenship or engaged citizens can go and challenge, since you've had this similar experience, are there ways in which we can go and challenge these like laws in terms of like self-led research projects or investigative journalism?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I mean, I think there are some things where it's with like the U.S. political system where I do think it's some of that is better to do as a U.S. citizen, but I think there are other things that you definitely can do regardless of where you are. And I think one example of that I think is really true is these companies are releasing these like preparedness frameworks and these system cards, and like I just don't think that many people read them, and like they don't read them that closely. And I just think like more people should read them, and they should like comment publicly and write about ways in which they seem insufficient or don't make sense, because they very frequently are insufficient and make sense. And I think one thing that has been a thought that I've had and talked with other people who worked on these laws of like, we're requiring companies to disclose these things, but like, is anyone paying attention? Is anyone reading them or like seeing what is disclosed? And like there are a few people who do that, but like the number is just not that high. And again, I do think there's I think people rightfully complain a lot about different social media platforms, and I have lots of issues about it. Well, but at the same time, like you can if you quote tweet some the release of a new model and system card with your analysis of it, like, people will see it and talk about it, and researchers and policymakers do see it. And again, that was one experience I had from, talking about my subpoena online. And again, I actually had previously talked to media before I had posted on X, and it had not actually gotten as much attention. So again, like, I do think there is real ability for just individual people, regardless of where you are, where if you do, like, post good analysis, that, like, it can get attention and can get attention from, policymakers and researchers within companies. And so again, there's more to say there. There's, like, in general, I think, and I frequently feel and talk to others about this, that the amount of things the companies are doing at all times that I deserve more scrutiny, and that they are partly relying on just people not paying attention to, is exhausting and overwhelming. And I'm one of the people who's trying to keep up with that and call them out when they're doing it. But, like, I feel like they're just, I literally have, like, a list on my computer of, like, things that I want to publicly complain about that companies are doing that I have not had time to do because there's just other things to do, and there keep becoming more things. But, like, yes, please, there's very much, wherever you are, I think there's really valuable work to be done here. And I think we need far more people who are, smart and taking the details seriously and understand some of the technical details of these systems, calling out companies when they're, going back on their word or doing practices that seem risky or concerning. And so I'd love to see more people on the call do that. And I think there's, it's easier to get involved and contribute to that than you might think.
Yep. Thank you so much.
I don't know why my raise hand feature isn't working.
Go for it.
Can I ask you? Yeah, thanks. Sort of hitching off of the last question and just generally the topic of getting more involved. Is there any way that we could, I don't know, help out or volunteer with Encode specifically?
I'll put my email in the chat, and people can reach out. I think we don't, like, generally take volunteers, but I'm happy to chat with people, and depending on your interest, maybe things to help with. But I'll put my email, and I'm happy to at least try to, depending on what your interest is or what you're hoping to contribute with, can at least maybe try to talk about what opportunities might exist. You may have to bother me and email me multiple times, but I do, but I'm enthusiastic about trying to figure out ways for people to contribute. So anyway, short answer is, like, we don't have volunteers in general, but I'm happy for people to reach out, and excited that people are interested in contributing, because I do think there are lots of ways to contribute.
All right, thank you.
And I'll jump in if it's all right. So Jared Kaplan, who's one of the co-founders of Anthropic, a couple of months ago, did an interview with The Guardian where he said the biggest choice was looming, and it's around recursive self-improvement. And listening to Dario speak at Davos, it kind of sounded like that choice had already been made. And maybe that's overstating it, but I'm not sure. Where is that conversation happening? What are the right levers and pressure points to have it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is the kind of trillion-dollar civilizational question, and I agree that I do get the sense that, like, and again, without knowing anything, like, again, I don't know, like, any particularly like private information on this, just from what I'm seeing in public and what I'm seeing in what it's putting out, that I do think that, like, Anthropic, for instance, has real apprehensions about kind of, like, going for this, like, automated AI R&D recursive self-improvement, but also they think that, there are people right behind or appears to them who are, even more more reckless than they are. I feel like I do get the sense that, like, they generally, some of the different folks, like, range in opinions to it, and I think a lot of the key companies, like, do have, like, real apprehensions about automated AI R&D and really just slamming the accelerator on that. But I think they're going to do it, and at least as we currently are going. So again, I don't really know how to I think there's some amount of just people, pointing out of just like in these, I do hope that things like these safety plans can reveal that like the companies do not have a good plan for dealing with this. They don't know what they're doing. Like they do not have a plan for like, if they have systems that are much more capable than the ones they currently have, and really do. And I think there are lots of complexities and questions about, to some degree we're kind of already having some recursive self-improvement of like, models are helping with other models and like that's, but it's not, kind of like a super crazy intelligence explosion or completely automated R&D. But yeah, I mean, anyway, none of this is that satisfying, but I share your analysis, but it does seem like the companies are going for it, and that this is disconcerting and scary, and that I think, I think ultimately do need to see just kind of government action and regulation on at least like trying to have additional constraints and rules at a minimum about the way that this is happening, and trying to have it happen in a safer way. But I would be lying if I said I had a great plan for how to think about this, because I don't think anyone does, and it does kind of seem like it's happening.
Understood. Appreciate your thoughts.
I had a question. So a lot of governments work directly with AI companies for different programs, innovation efforts that they have. So I was curious about kind of the intersection of these new laws, like California's Frontier AI. Just sent a link. Florida's House is doing something similar as well, although their target seems to be more particularly data centers. So I'm just curious, like from like the procurement perspective, like how do you see the relationship with government and AI changing in the next year or two?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think one area where, again, like I've talked about some different limitations, despite really, again, believing that things like SB53 are a very important step of, one limitation they have is that, for instance, if the government and, for instance, like the military procures a model, it's completely exempt from the requirements of SB53 or any other law that at least like a state can pass. And so when you do have, for instance, Google or OpenAI or others, selling their models to the Pentagon and the Department of War, I think that is going to be an area that is just completely in parallel to whatever kind of constraints and rules are placed on civilian uses of models. And I think that is something that is, super important and worth following, and kind of, making sure that we are thinking really serious about safety and risks in those contexts as well, for obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, in some ways, I think this relates a little bit to the similar points about money that is being put into it and how it's shaping the political process, where I on the one hand, I do think procurement can be used as a lever for the government, where like the companies want to sell to governments, and then governments can place requirements on selling and saying, we're going to sell to people who have these, safety practices, or do these, transparency things, or have good cybersecurity rules, and can kind of use this procurement as a lever. Obviously, it kind of goes the other way, and they themselves will want to make sure they have the continued access to this technology, and so yeah, I think it's definitely an important dynamic to watch. I don't know if that fully addresses it, but I definitely think the kind of ways in which government is purchasing technology from the private sector here is going to be a very important dynamic, and I expect those relationships to deepen a lot in the months and years to come.
Yeah, I'm asking because I actually work at a government tech company. So if you're interested, I would love to connect you to our general counsel.
Yeah, I'm feel free to reach out. No promises I can be help, but can maybe give my 2 cents. But yeah, sounds good.
Cool. I reached out on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Do we have any more questions from the group? All right, I think this will be our last one. Esra.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just wondering, what are, like, just to follow up on my previous questions, because like you ended up getting a subpoena at the end of the day for something. So what are ways to do this that you know, will mitigate some risks for the participants? Like like what are things that participants who are engaged citizens and they want to contribute in terms of research or like investigative journalism, like what are ways for them to contribute, but like things that they should be aware of while they're doing that?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. I mean, I do think one thing that I would like to convey is like, you know, I was subpoenaed, but at the end of the day, like I, you know, was able to get connected with pro bono lawyers who like represent us for free, and I didn't have to pay. Ultimately, I didn't have to turn over any documents, and also I talked about it and got a ton of public support, and I got into stuff like this. So like, I do think there's an aspect where like, again, it sucked and was a very unpleasant experience. Also, like, it was fine. And again, I think that I do think it's just important that like part of why I feel like I want to, you know, come and talk to people like this and other things is to reassure people that like you can be targeted by these companies and they are unpopular and people will have your back and they will, you know, and, you know, make that, you know, that's not to say that you should be, you know, reckless, or again, like I think there's some aspect where you should be careful to, you know, not do anything that is illegal or that is, you know, but like if you are just someone who wants to really forcefully criticize companies for things they're doing, you should feel confident in doing that, and that there will be, you know, a lot of people who want to, you know, support you and make you able to do that. There's also some aspect where like if you're not in the United States, the ability for them to like subpoena for this specific thing is also harder. Again, that's you know, I had a colleague who was in London who I think was similarly situated to me, but he did not get a subpoena because of, you know, they're just like international conventions around how they can do discovery. Again, also subpoena, like it wasn't like they were accusing us, like we weren't getting indicted or getting sued. They were like just asking us documents as part of a lawsuit they were doing, and that lawsuit is also now done with the stage at which they have discovery, at least for a while. So again, I do want to, I've had some conversations with people about sharing my story of people I think maybe being nervous about criticizing companies because of fear of retaliation. And on the one hand, I do understand that, but like, I do just want to say that like, again, like it was to some degree, like these there's not that much they can do. And there are also a lot of people who are on the watch, and lots of, you know, media and other people who, you know, want to call out companies when they do this behavior. And I think that those have been a deterrent to some of this. And so I definitely wouldn't want like sharing my story to make people feel like more nervous about criticizing companies. And I hope kind of the opposite of like the fact that it wasn't pleasant, but also that like there was a lot of support, and me and my organization are fine, and in some ways are like, you know, better off for the experience, if anything. I hope is instructive to other people too.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
And one other thing to say, I don't know, my mom is also here in the call, and she got you know, subpoenaed by tobacco companies actually as well for her work with the pediatricians back in the day. So anyway, I've you know, thankful to have family who have told me to not be too afraid of this. So that's good.
Yeah, I guess I was curious because I'm curious about the way this like building systems that encourage people to do this kind of thing, but also like helps them be aware of how the process could like happen. And like, I don't know, maybe there are anonymity protections that you can do, things like that. So I'm trying to think through that.
Yeah, no, of course. You know, there's, you know, I think there are organizations that work on, you know, like I think the signal network or something, and there's like Whistleblower Aid and some other organizations that do for people who are particularly, again, like it's worth saying that like the risks to incur as someone within a company kind of speaking out, I think are just necessarily going to be larger than someone kind of external to a company criticizing them, just because when you're with a company, maybe, you know, you've signed lots of contracts and you have lots of access to like private information that, you know, you maybe made, you know, commitments around non-disclosure. And again, like when I'm saying my comments there are more honestly towards like people who are external critic, not to say I think people within companies also should, you know, be very mindful of what their rights are and should be willing to, you know, blow the whistle in ways that, you know, like are increasingly protected by law. But that is just like a more complicated area. And again, there are also, you know, I think organizations that work on trying to have, you know, anonymous things, and you know, there are also, you know, ways of speaking to press and things like that that protect your identity and you know, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say, and maybe I can follow up with the organizer around like sharing some of these resources about like some of the organizations who do work with, you know, with whistleblowers or help like talk people through of, you know, sharing information. They're worried about retaliation and ways of doing that while, you know, protecting themselves and their identity in different ways. And so yeah, can potentially share some resources on that. But yeah, appreciate the question.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So we're a little over time. Thank you so much, Nathan, for the great conversation today. I learned a lot. And thank you everyone for joining. So we'll be closing this out, and we'll share the video online as well so that everyone has access going forward. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your days.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.